Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to wait for people to come in, but my name is Vivian. I'm a product marketing manager at Bubble, and I'd like to welcome you to Bubble's webinar on optimizing workload of your Bubble app. And some of you might have encountered me in various places by email, on the blog, previous live events like the responsive launch. I'm really glad you're here today. I think that the goal of this webinar is really to give you an overview with specific live demo examples of tips and tricks for improving the efficiency of your Bubble apps. So whether this is your first time you've ever looked at your logs tab, or if you're a power user from the forum, I think the content today is really going to be focused on the best practices and principles with building with this new metric. But first, in terms of our agenda, I'm going to invite Emmanuel, our co-founder, co-CEO of Bubble, to the stage to talk a little bit more about a few words from his perspective on the backdrop of why this is all happening, sort of where this is coming from, and hopefully get to hear more from him. So welcome to stage, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Vivian. And hello, everyone. I can see a lot of people from a lot of different places, so it's great to have everyone here. I'm really happy we can do this event now because this is a very important topic for the community and for the company. You know, introducing a new pricing metric is a very big moment when it's for a service like ours. And I know the last couple of weeks have been rough and stressful. I want to thank everyone here for their understanding and patience and for the feedback that gave us, because this is something that we need to go through together. The team has been working really hard, both prior to the announcement, obviously, but after the announcement, to ensure that this transition is as smooth as possible for people. And that's, you know, this webinar is part of this. Some tooling, like we're making some improvements to what you can see in the editor, and the team will be sharing that in a few minutes, you know, how to use these different tools with a lot of, you know, also content. One thing that I want to reiterate, because, you know, it can be complicated with legacy, is that until you migrate your app to new plans, this new metric is something you can measure, but it's not going to be impacting how your application works and how much you pay until October 2024. So there is a lot of time here for you to work with our team if you're hitting some difficult situations in terms of usage, so that the transition is as smooth as possible. What I would like to discuss a little bit today is explain why we're doing this. I mean, that's a question that we've seen a lot over the last couple of weeks, is why is Bubble doing this and not just raising prices? And so I think it's a good opportunity to explain the rationale of why we're doing this. And it's much more easier to do that live than through a blog post or forum post. I'll let the team get into the more technical aspect of how, you know, workload unit work. But it's really important to introduce, you know, why this metric is actually really necessary for the platform to succeed in the long term. If you look back in time, we introduced capacity in 2017 when Bubble was much less performant. And so for those in the audience that were in Bubble back then, application would basically get throttled very frequently, if not all the time. And so what we thought back then is that, you know, for people who had a willingness to pay to have a faster application, they could buy more capacity and that would drive upgrade. And it did work pretty well for a couple of years, but what we found out, and honestly, had we thought about that in 2017, we would not have chosen that metric. Like, the big mistake we made was back then, is that as we make performance improvements to the platform, people started being throttled less. And so effectively, we were hoping that capacity could be the metrics that enables us to ensure that people that use our resources more pay more, so that we can keep having people who try out having very cheap plans. Just didn't work. And what we hoped would be like a big revenue driver for us turned out to be a smaller and smaller part of our revenue to today. Like, this is a very low percentage of our revenue with capacity. And so it's a problem we identified about 2 years ago now. That led us to, you know, the first pricing announcement we made last year with DB-Things, which were the wrong metric for many reasons. But the intent behind was to actually start having a metric that scales with usage, because it is really important for a platform like ours that ambitions to be a platform where people can grow on top, and that makes its product really cheap on the low end of usage, to have something that scales with usage. Otherwise, it just doesn't work economically for anyone, and that's not a good thing in the long term of the platform. So today, I mean, after we spent a long time thinking a bit about this new unit and the workload, and I'm really confident this is the right metric to ensure that, again, people scale their usage, that the bill and the usage scale together at the same time. Now, the challenge when we introduce a new metric is that it does lead to a situation that we saw and that people were describing a lot on social platforms, Twitter and the forum in particular, with people having a very high increase just because, and it's not many applications in percentage, but in absolute terms, it is quite a few people because we have a lot of users at this point, with people having very high usage. And so we want to really work with everyone here. Like what we want to make sure is that, this new metric, when it comes into action in October 2024, because again, it's 18 months from now, doesn't actually drive, applications to fail. There might be some adjustments to be made on the applications, and that's what our team want to help you with. And this webinar is the first thing, is our first step to do this. The last thing I would say about this metric, because it's something that we heard a lot during like the rollout that we had a couple of weeks ago, is we're building this metric in the spirit that we want to do well when our users do well. Like the point of what we're doing here is not to try to make money if someone makes a mistake. If someone makes a mistake when they develop their application and suddenly consume a lot of units, it's not how we're going to be scaling the platform and create what I hope Bubble becomes, which is a standard for programming. We want to make sure that people pay us more when they start, performing well on the platform, in a sense that they have a lot of traffic and therefore derive value from what they're building because they have either many users or it's solving like more problems for their businesses. And so as we go through this transition of introducing a new metric, we're going to be very careful and look at every instance where we see like a big spike of usage or something to understand what is the reason behind that. Is it a mistake? Is it a design decision that just doesn't work well? Or is it actually legitimate usage? And so our team will be very much on deck for the next few weeks and beyond to ensure that we have the metric that really helps us, again, grow the platform and Bubble's cost for applications as they grow themselves and derive more value. So now I'll let Kate take the room. Kate has been a PM with us for almost 2 years now, I think, at this point, and has been leading a lot of projects around pricing. And she's going to be explaining a little bit at the high level what workload is about and how it differs from capacity, and then the different tooling that we've put together to help people navigate this.
Awesome. Thanks, Manuel. Yeah, so hi, I'm Kate. I'm the product manager here for the team that's been working on the workload metric tooling and the logs tab of the Bubble editor. Like Emmanuel said, I'll give a high-level overview of what workload is. I know many of you have probably read the documentation on breaking down workload, but if you haven't, don't worry, we'll be sharing those resources throughout this webinar. Then we'll hop over into the logs tab and then close off with what the roadmap looks like in the future. So let's start about what is workload. Workload is a metric that measures the work that Bubble does to power your app. In other words, this is Bubble's way of quantifying all the underlying activities your app does as it runs. So it's different from capacity, which is a moment in time cap. Workload is a measure of total usage of the work over a longer period of time. So let's use the analogy of driving a car. Capacity is like the speed limit. So Bubble will enforce a cap similar to the speed limit on the power needed for your application to run at a certain moment of time. Whereas workload is like the distance your car travels regardless of speed. Some days your application may require Bubble to do a lot of work to power your app, while other days it may be less. And workload is the aggregate total of that work across all of those days. So now that we've kind of all got on hopefully the same page with workload, and definitely read into the docs for more information, I'll hop over to the logs tab and show you exactly what it looks like within your editor.
And for those of you who are just joining us and have been asking questions in the chat, yes, this will be recorded for you, and you'll receive it at the end as an automated email. It'll also be posted on our blog at some point, so you'll have multiple copies for it. But thank you all again for joining us, and if you have any other questions, let me know.
Awesome. I think we can all see my screen now. Wanted to hop into the editor. What we're looking at here is the logs tab. So last tab down here. As you hop into this, you'll see that there's a few new charts that we have and a few new data points on this tab. The first is going to be the workload usage for the last 30 days. So this is the aggregation of all the workload units that your app has been using over the last 30 days. So this would date back to March 20th here. Then it's broken down into development versus live usage. Development being the development version that your app is running, and then live being that live version. For this application, we can scroll down and really see the bar chart here, which shows the trends over these 30 days. You can see where peaks and valleys are in terms of your workload usage and what's consuming workload in your application on a higher trend kind of view. For each of these days, you can actually click into the bar chart. Now, a lot of people didn't realize that, so I definitely want to highlight that you can click into the days and see the usage over that day, which will give you an hour by hour breakdown. Also, when you click into the days, this is reflective of the total that you see above. So in this case, we're seeing the end of April 2nd to the almost full day of April 3rd as aggregated at the top here and broken down again, development versus live. You can click in again. So let's say that we want to check out what was happening at 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. this hour of this day. You can click into it. Not only does it reflect here, but if we want to drill down and see which activities are making up workload at this time, this will also be reflecting in the pie chart below. So this is showing us April 3rd, 9 a.m. to April 3rd at 10 a.m. For each of these categories, once you hover over it, it shows the percentage of how much it's contributing to the overall workload that's representing in the pie chart. It also shows you the exact workload units. So in this case, anything that's categorized as fetching data, so searches, aggregate searches, is taking up about 6,000 workload units for this app for this particular time during the day. Now, if we want to drill down more, let's take workflows, for example. We can click into this part of the pie chart and then be able to see all the workflows that are consuming workload at this time. Now, a lot of the activities on this list, if we go back just a second, these are what activities are consuming workload for this time. For the full list of activities, check out our documentation. We list everything that's going into workload that's possible for any activity, but let's go back into clicking into workflow. So this is showing all the workflows for this time. Again, hover states, show percentage, and overall workload consumption. If we want to drill down and say, okay, but where in the editor is this being called? I really want to optimize this and go to the exact location. We can actually click on the activity slice itself, and it will navigate exactly to the workflow that's causing this. So in this case, it's preview job email. We're able to go in, see the different actions that are popping up. In future iterations, we definitely want to be able to pinpoint the particular action because we know a lot of workflows have a lot of actions in some cases, which could consume different amount of workload units. So that's a breakdown of the pie chart here. For more information, check out our documentation and you'll see that we have some people coming up soon that'll show us exactly how they are navigating through it. Also wanted to mention what's coming out on the roadmap. We do have a few things that have already come out, and we'll have some things coming out in the future, some bug fixes that we have going on, more drill downs, so like the drill downs I was just showing, and then also including the most recent hour. So really helping with the optimization use cases.
Thank you, Kate. And for those of you joining us, I think I'm going to remind you that the session is recorded, but also that we are now going to go into the optimization side of the webinar. We wanted to give a high-level overview just because there's a broad range of people coming to Bubble. Some people are very advanced and some people are just starting out, may have just discovered the Logs tab for the first time. So I'd like to invite Jonathan on to actually get to optimization and sort of tips and tricks for finding and solving common inefficiencies. So thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Vivian. Hi, everyone. So yeah, my name's Jonathan. I'm a technical success manager here at Bubble. We may have talked if you've submitted a support ticket in the past year or so. But yeah, so today what we're going to talk about is just some basic optimization tips. These are pretty low level, so if you're an advanced bubbler, you may still learn something here, but this is really for beginners and kind of just taking a first look at your Bubble app and beginning the optimization process. So before we get started, I wanted to touch on a few things to keep in mind when optimizing your Bubble app. So first, Bubble is infinitely flexible. So there's no right or wrong way to build something in Bubble, but there are a few there are a few best practices to keep in mind when building on Bubble. So second, timing is everything. So now with the introduction of workload units, we really want to start building our apps to be reactive instead of proactive. So I'll go into a little bit more detail what that means in the live example here in the editor. And then lastly, we should only build what is necessary. Bubble's a great platform. It's super easy to build on. And you may be tempted to say, hey, I need to track page loads on my app. That's a 30-second implementation, probably a lot easier than signing up for something like Segment or Google Analytics. But that's not something that Bubble is built for, and there's always a better tool for something like that. And we'll touch on that here in just a second. So I'm going to jump into the editor here and show you a few examples that I've built. So give me 1 second to share my screen.
And for those of you who are joining us again, I'm going to share some resources about this, and we're also going to be sharing the deck as a handout in addition to the recording, so you can take a look at the blog post that we just had on improving workload efficiency. This is going to cover a lot of things in detail that Jonathan's going to go over. So, but definitely follow along. We have some really cool live demo apps from within Bubble to show you.
Yeah, so perfect. Thank you, Vivian. So the first thing we're going to take a look at here kind of touches back to the previous thing I just mentioned, which is only doing what is necessary with Bubble. So this kind of fits into the category of excessive database activity. So we want to limit how often we write and read from our database, because that, of course, costs workload units. So in this example, what I've got here is just a simple workflow that when the page is loaded, we are creating a new log in the database, and we're tracking the action. And in this case, it's page loaded. And then we're going to track the user that that is loading the page. So while this works, and this takes probably 30 seconds to set up, believe it or not, this action, because we're starting an action, we're writing to the database, we're writing, the current user and everything. This can take almost 2 workload units per page load. So while this works on a small scale, as your app scales and you hit thousands and thousands of page views, this is no longer very feasible for you. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative here is to use a service such as Google Analytics or Segment. In this case, I'm using Segment. This is the official Bubble plugin for Segment. And it's essentially the same exact workflow, right? So when the page is loaded, we're sending a page view to Segment. And in here, I just have a page category set to example. We can add additional values if we want to, send the user, send any additional context. And the great thing about this is it all runs client side. So no workload unit consumption whatsoever. So that's a great alternative, and it kind of touches back to doing only what you need to in Bubble. So we don't have to track our page views in Bubble. And perhaps a better alternative is to use a service that is built for tracking activities. So the next tip that we want to touch on is regarding conditionals and using searches within conditionals. So a common thing that I've done some one-on-ones with our users, and I've seen some inefficiencies when it comes to the sign-up form that you might have on your app. So here, what I have is just a simple email address input. We're not doing the password right now, but we're just looking at the email. So you can see this email input doesn't have a conditional at all, right? So the user doesn't necessarily know whether or not they've used their email address for your service, but likely they haven't. Over here, what we have is a conditional that is searching for users and seeing if their email address matches our input. And if it does, it's going to return true. And we're going to change the border color to red to indicate, hey, this email address has already been used. And while this works, and especially, like I said, it works on a small scale, as you continue to grow, let's say you have 100,000 users, this search is going to become very heavy. And not only does this trigger when the user starts typing or changes anything in the input, it's also going to trigger when anything happens, anything updates regarding users on the back end, which if you have 100,000 users, that's going to happen quite often. So what's the alternative here? Well, the alternative really, and I'm going to pop open this example here, you can see that it works, but the alternative here is to, instead of running this conditional, we can just let the default bubble alert alert the user that the email address has already been used. So we've all seen it. If you try to create a user, oh, it's not going to show here, of course, but Bubble will pop up a browser alert that says that this email address is already in use. So we can also customize that. We could put another, we could catch the error and put something, some text under here to tell them, hey, you might already have an account. Do you want to sign in with that account? And this is really a great way to save workload units, because 9 times out of 10, a new user to your platform likely didn't have their email already in your database. So this is going to return false almost all the time, but you're still spending workload units to get the false result here. So, the small things like that, you're thinking, right now, hey, this is a great solution for me, but as in 18 months, when you start paying with workload units, maybe this isn't the best way to go about it. And for that small percentage of users who are trying to sign up with the same email address, you can use the native alert. So next, we're going to hop back to the editor. So let me go over there. And we're going to take a look at backend and recursive workflows. And in this example, what we're looking at here is an example of, let's say you have an API and you need to check it for changes. And let's say you're checking it every second. So in this example here, I'm not using a recursive backend workflow, but I'm using a do every 1 second. And I've got my example API set up here that's just checking for changes in our local database, just to kind of simulate doing what's called polling. So that in programming, this is typically called polling. We're checking every second. If we get a different result from the API, then we're going to make that change and then continue polling and looking for changes. So really the best practice here, and I'm using a database trigger here to kind of simulate a webhook, is to use a webhook. So instead of, and this touches back to that principle that I shared earlier, where instead of being reactive, or instead of being proactive and checking for things to do and continually doing things, which works on the old model, but now with workload units isn't ideal, we can be reactive rather than proactive. So we have this trigger here, which, let's say it's a webhook, it's waiting for a service such as Stripe to send out, hey, this user updated their customer profile and here's the changes. So we want to we want to be reactive. So when something comes to our app, then we catch it and we make the changes in our database. So kind of a quick example of what this looks like is, so in our live demo here, so here's my webhook. This is my sample webhook. Right now, the values are the same. And we can see that every time that our webhook is triggered, we spend 1.12 workload units per triggered action. Okay, so if somebody updates their Stripe customer profile, we're gonna consume 1.12 workload units to update their profile in our database. Now, if we were polling Stripe's customer profile endpoint looking for changes, in this example, we're using 0.32 workload units per each poll. So that's happening every second. So you can imagine how that adds up. And if a change does happen and we need to change something in the database, then the entire polling plus the changing of the data is 1.43 workload units. So, you can see when I simulate a change on the back end, they both change. Funnily enough, this is a little bit faster because it's immediately reacting to the change that's submitted rather than polling and looking for the change. But you can see that while they do the same thing, one is much more efficient in terms of workload usage. So the last thing that I want to touch on is a pretty common thing that I've seen when working with users. Let me hop back over to the editor really quick. And that is nested data in repeating groups. So often we see that we have, often we have data and then we have related data. So in this example over here, we have contacts, and for each contact, we are also looking for that contact's communications. Let's say these are phone calls or emails. that are related to this contact. So in this example over here, we have our repeating group where we're doing a search for contacts. We're just pulling all of our contacts. And then for each cell, what we're doing is we have a nested repeating group here. And we are doing a search for communications where the contact is the current cell's contact. This is a pretty normal thing, right? We think, okay, well, for each cell, I need to search for that contact's communications. But the thing to think about is instead of a single search for all of the contacts, we're actually, let's say we had 1,000 contacts and we needed to search for each contact's communications. So the initial search for contacts is one search, and then for each contact, we have to do another search for the communications. And so, of course, that's 1,001 searches. Not quite ideal. So what's the alternative to that? So the alternative is to link your related data types together. So in this instance, in this example, let's hop over to the data tab. If we look at our contact, I've added a list of communications. So long as you're not saving thousands and thousands of communications per contact, this is a great way to reduce searches by just storing a list of related communications on the contact data type. So when I'm over here and I'm doing my search, I have my current cell, or my current cell, and then here in the nested repeating group, everything's the same, but instead of doing a search, I'm referencing the current cell's contacts communications. And this really saves a lot of workload units because Bubble is combining these searches into one. So instead of doing 1,001 searches, we're back to doing just one search, which returns all contacts and all of that contact's communications. And then we can reference this here. You could even, if you wanted to, if you needed to filter this down, you could use, you can come into here and then we could say, hey, let's, oops, not group by, sorry about that. We want to filter it, and then we can filter the results that have already been returned. So there's always use cases for everything in Bubble. So in some cases, doing an additional search, if you're only going to list 5 things, that's not a huge deal. But if you're listing thousands of things, such as posts with its comments, you might want to consider using linking data types. So that was just a few of our. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Yeah, so that was just a few quick examples. We looked at excessive database activities, recurring recursive workflows on the back end, conditionals with searches, and then repeating group data. I know that some of these tips are a little bit basic for those advanced bubblers out there, but it's always good to kind of go back to basics and really, when evaluating your app's optimization and things like that. So I hope this was helpful, and thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I think it's also important to remind, the thing I love about Bubble is that everybody's use cases are very specific. We see so much diversity in what people build. And so it's often when we're building programming around how to teach people things, it's challenging to get into every person's specific use case. But I actually wanted to invite someone from our own team who is a Bubble developer and works both on our Bubble website and his own Bubble app, to sort of walk through kind of the principles of actually how do you even think about triaging. Say you already have an app and you built it and there's some inefficiencies in it. So I am gonna turn it over to Andrew from our team.
Thanks, Vivian. Yeah, my name is Andrew. I'm
triage.
One of the Bubble developers here at Bubble. Officially, our team is responsible for our main website. When you go there and log in, manage your apps, all of that. We also help with some internal apps that Bubble maintains behind the scenes for various purposes. And I love what I do. It's a dream job. But one of the things that really popped into my head early on as we started to talk about workload in particular was some of my side projects. So I have 3 or 4 apps that I've built on the side. They're side hustles of mine. And we're going to talk about one of those in particular today, which is Shoot Assist. And so I'm going to take you on a ride along here in a second where we triage the heaviest workload consumer in Shoot Assist. And I'll walk you through my process of identifying what that particular area is. And then some of my hypotheses is about how I can address those areas and improve workload usage overall in that particular area. Walk you through all of that. First, I feel like it might be helpful just to have a background on Shoot Assist in general, just so you can understand the particular niche a little bit better. So Shoot Assist is a CRM that's built specifically for volume photographers. And volume photography is a really fancy way of saying school portraits. And it happens to be the business that my family was in. And so Shoot Assist was built, it was a total labor of love for my parents and for my mom in particular, to solve some problems that she was having in just keeping on top of all of the details in their business. And so that's what Shoot Assist is. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's find the right tab here. Give me just a second. And take you into the Logs tab, which is the first place that I went to identify what particular areas of Shoot Assist were heaviest and what it is that I could do about it to make Shoot Assist more efficient and just in general really reduce workload consumption across the board. One thing I do want to call out here is I am a total nerd when it comes to this stuff. I love experimentation, especially when it's data-driven. And so stuff like this, I get really excited about and would encourage you in your apps to really think through how you can be data-driven in your approach to understanding the heaviest areas of your app and how you can address them, measure it, and then repeat based on whatever learnings that came out of measuring and continue to apply those changes to your app. I think it's a really great point that in general, your use case is going to be varied wildly from other people who are building on Bubble. And so really the best way to address these areas in your particular app is to identify the heaviest areas of your app, measure as you make changes, and then repeat that process again and again. So with that being said, here we are on the Logs tab of Shoot Assist. And I've already gone ahead and clicked into a day. Let me actually go back out to the 30-day view here. So one of the things that Kate mentioned earlier is that you can drill down. And generally my process jumping into Shoot Assist was just, I want to understand the heaviest areas in Shoot Assist and kind of make a priority list for myself of what are the areas that are most dire or that I could have the biggest impact if I were to make some changes. And so generally my approach here is to look for the biggest part of the pie chart and continue drilling down into that until I can find that particular area of Shoot Assist. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here. It's very clear that fetching data is consuming an outsized portion of workload overall in Shoot Assist. And so I'll click onto that. And then search is still outsized. So that's also the heaviest consumer. And if I drill in further, we can see this search for tasks first item. And so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Overall, I feel confident that this is the heaviest area of all of the app. So we found our first area. Now what we're looking at here happens to be a workflow report inside of Shoot Assist, which is an incredibly important feature to the photographers that are using Shoot Assist. And probably the easiest way to give you a peek at what it does and why it's so heavy is to show you the front end. So this is the dev version of Shoot Assist. But what this report is doing is that photographers in Shoot Assist list out tasks. In Shoot Assist, I call them template tasks. They're going to essentially write out, these are the steps that have to be completed for a job to be done and successful in Shoot Assist. So they define those, and then they create their jobs, which you see down the left side here. And then anytime that a job is created, Shoot Assist is going to create a job-specific copy of that template task, and it's going to assign it to those jobs. And so what this report does is it allows a photographer to come in and look at an entire season at once and see exactly where they are in the season. Honestly, it's the most important feature of Shoot Assist because photographers really love having a bird's eye view of exactly how the job's going. But you can see there's a lot of data here that's being displayed on the page. So this is scrollable. There's even more tasks than you saw at first page load. So all of these are here. I'm just scrolling back here. But so really my first step, once I identified that this was a particularly heavy area, is I wanted to understand why. And this is where experimentation comes in, because essentially we're going to create some hypothesis of why we think that this happens to be the heaviest area and what in particular we can change about it to try to improve performance. So there's a couple things that come to mind for me right off the bat. If you're familiar with Bubble, you know that the way Bubble works is anytime data from a particular record happens to be downloaded on the page, Bubble downloads the entire record. That's just how Bubble is architected. I saw on Josh's post just recently that that is something we're looking into at some point, and I personally am very excited about seeing where that research heads. But for now, if you download any data from a record, you're downloading the entire record. And so for me, this simple column over here, which happens to list the client of a particular job and the date of the job, is actually incredibly heavy to the overall performance of this tab. Because to display that info, I'm actually downloading all of the records of the job. And there's a lot of data behind the scenes for other parts of Shoot Assist that are necessary for jobs in general, but not necessary at all for this particular table. So that was the first thing that came to mind. The other thing, some other thoughts that popped into my head, and honestly, the biggest one, if we go back to, let me jump back to here for a second, is the individual cell. This is actually what the Logs tab reported. And the reason that this cell is so expensive is looking at the table again, for every single one of these squares, I'm having to cross-reference the job and the template task to then do a search for the individual task that is job specific and understand if it's been completed or not. And if it hasn't been completed, if it's behind schedule, because these tasks have a due date. And so the red ones that you see happen to be tasks that are behind schedule. They haven't been checked off yet. And it's those searches that are the heaviest out of the entire report, because for every row in the table, we're doing however many searches there are templates in the list. And so this gets really heavy. Now, obviously, not all that impressive when you look at this report here, but on the front end, for instance, at my family's business, there's 100 jobs in each of these reports and at least 20 template tasks for every job. And so if you do the math, it gets really heavy, really fast. And so, okay, we've got our hypothesis. We understand the heaviest part of the app. Where do we go from here? Well, for me, the next step was, okay, let's start making some changes and measuring those changes over time. And so what I've secretly been doing, I haven't notified users, I haven't had any visual changes in the app, is that over the last couple of weeks, I've been pushing updates to how I fetch the data, how my searches are set up and constrained. And so you'll notice there's actually 5 different workflow reports that on about a week basis, I have been deploying a particular update, swapping it in as the regular report that users see, and then looking at the capacity chart to understand if it had an impact or not, what that impact was, and what I can learn from it going forward, with the ultimate goal being that I can settle on a solution that I feel confident has best solved the problem at least as much as I can. And so if we go back to the Logs tab here, and we click back to the 30 days, we can see that my tests have had a significant impact on, I'm just kidding. Very thankful for the adjustment here that has dropped this. I am extending my testing a little bit just to understand how my changes are performing from test to test. But the biggest thing that I would call out here is that the 30-day overview of your workload usage is really, really helpful in understanding trends and how your changes in particular are impacting your application over time. And so all of that said, we haven't actually talked about a practical solution. So I want to dive into that really quick. I think that you'll find this really interesting. So first of all, I'm going to jump back here. So we know that my hypothesis is that the data being returned about each job is very heavy. We also know that the individual searches over on this section is even more heavy because each of those individual searches is costing me workload usage on the page. And so the current solution that I'm testing and really excited about is that I've actually created a backend endpoint where I am temporarily creating a new data type that I'm feeding to the front end in order to cut down overall on the total data that's having to be passed to the page, and also to cut down on the individual searches that have to be done on the page to understand if each job-specific task has been completed or not. So just to show you how I'm doing this, we can see that I've got this endpoint. So it's this workflow report endpoint. And we can see here I'm constructing just a little bit of JSON to make this work. So I'm doing my search for jobs on the back end. And you can see that I'm defining just the particular fields that I need on the front end. So if we look at that report, really the only fields I care about are the name of the client and the date. And then I also want to be smart that I can look up the job if I need to. So I'm including a unique ID. And then I've constructed an array here where I'm passing just the completed tasks. And that means that instead of having to search for all of the tasks that might be included in the report, I'm only actually pulling the completed tasks associated with a particular job, which will actually cut down pretty significantly on the total amount of data that's being passed to the front end. Now, I know that the searches are still being run on the back end, so there are some workload usage, or there is some workload usage to be considered from that. But the general thought here is that if I can cut down on the many individual searches on the front end, that could have a significant effect on the page overall, total amount of data being searched. And so really excited about this approach overall, and just wanted to call it out as an example of ways that you could look at your particular app with an experiment mentality to understand the heaviest areas of your app, how in particular you might be able to address those areas, and then what steps you might be able to take going forward to really have an impact on those areas in your app. And once again, if we're working from heaviest area of your app down, any changes that you're able to make will have a significant impact on a large portion of the overall workload usage in your app. So key takeaways, some just kind of recap here that might be helpful. Start with your biggest offender. Absolutely use that pie chart to your advantage to work down to whatever the heaviest area of your app is, and then go from there. Another thing is, and I think this is really important for all of us, is that there's time to experiment. So you have 18 months to be able to test this out in your app, to make changes, to measure those changes, to see the impact they have, and do the whole cycle again and again and again. So just want to stress that, really take your time, come at this with a scientific approach, measure those changes, and go from there. And then, my specific niche example here is that I think the biggest takeaway is any way that you can reduce the amount of data that has to be pulled or searched on a page will have a really big impact. And then finally, that last point there just kind of goes with the second point of trying a solution, come at this with a scientific mentality, try a solution, measure it, learn from the results, and then do the whole cycle again. And I think you'll be impressed with where you can get in terms of making your app more efficient.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to share the handout of this particular deck as a download. If you go to the handouts tab, you'll be able to see it. But there will be additional resources shared within it on how to improve your workload efficiency. There's some things you may have already seen for the manual about workload weights and how those are calculated, what's calculated and what's not calculated, and the workload explainer. And coming soon, we're going to be coming out with more advanced efficiency options, and we're also going to be updating our pricing page. eventually to reflect this. But there are 18 months, I think people are asking, it is October 2024, before workload becomes a feature of a pricing metric. So right now it's really about understanding and tooling around the dashboard that you see right here. I just want to make sure basically to thank everybody for your attendance. I think, the amount of care and attention paid in the Bubble community is kind of what makes it special to me. So really appreciate your time. Hope this was helpful in some ways. And if you know somebody who missed it or you want to share this information, there will be a link to the video. It will also be posted on our YouTube channel. You'll have all the recap of the materials here down the road. So thank you so much again for attending. Really appreciate it, and hope to see you around in the Bubble community.